This video was digitized from the original DVD in 2023 by Simply Franciscan. It is part of the Zmuda-Moffat Collection of video recordings of lectures given by Franciscan professors and theologians on topics of Franciscan theology, charism, spirituality, and ministry. The lectures span more than 20 years. The Zmuda-Moffat Collection captures some of the seminal lectures shared with the Franciscan family in the rediscovery of the Franciscan Intellectual Tradition, a process which began in the 1970s and continues today. Sister Lisa Zmuda and Sister Kathleen Moffat videotaped these lectures from approximately 2001 through 2022 with permission from the speakers. Separately, they created and distributed study guides to accompany the recordings. Those study guides are available with the videos. Please look for a link in the YouTube post. For further information on the Zmuda-Moffat Collection, please visit our website at simplyfranciscan.org.
Let me start with a quotation from a friend of mine and someone whom Finian already mentioned. I'd like to give credit to Joe Kenichi here because I think in many ways it was Joe's personal concern, both from his long years as a formation director himself, also as a teacher and as an historian. His deep concern was over what he saw as the possible loss of a tradition in our generation. And I'd like to quote from volume 1 of the publications of the CFIT series. I think many of you have probably seen this, called the Franciscan Intellectual Tradition. I'll be referring to these volumes in the coming days, so please go home and buy many. This is from Joe's article, which I would really recommend to you, called Institutional Amnesia and Resources for Franciscan Theology. Have you ever wondered whether or not you were reinventing the wheel? It is a frustrating experience. In preparing for these reflections, I have had the distinct impression that we members of the Franciscan family have been running around this same circle of the retrieval of our Franciscan intellectual tradition, especially in theology, for many years. At the Franciscan Educational Conference, held from August 16th to 19th, 1954, an announcement was made from the podium. Would all those interested in promoting a commission for Franciscan doctrinal synthesis, please contact Father Cyril Schursel, OFM. The membership even passed a resolution at the end of that meeting indicating that they were aware of the need of a Franciscan doctrinal synthesis and wanted to encourage its promoters. Here we are, some 50 years. Tomorrow will be next year will be the 50th anniversary of that meeting, and anticipating that perhaps, we are having this modern reincarnation of the Franciscan Intellectual Educational Conference to talk about the retrieval of our Franciscan intellectual tradition. Why are we doing this? Because something happened between 1954 and today. Those resources that were being gathered, those people who were being trained, those critical editions that were going to be published in just a few years, met the event of 1965, the Second Vatican Council, the social revolution in our society, and those projects were put on hold. Those friars left. Those friars moved into other fields of study. The intellectual life, let's admit it frankly, was belittled and marginalized during the renewal of the life of the order in the years following the Second Vatican Council. To be intellectual was to be not really very Franciscan. The academic was over against the pastoral. The classroom was put over against the parish or the field or the youth group, and the intellectual tradition suffered as a result. Our own programs of formation, which were once literally the seminarii, that is, were the seed houses, the greenhouses for growing new scholars, for training people in an ideology, a way of looking at the world, those structures collapsed. Increasingly, our members are trained with other members of religious communities who come from vastly different traditions, are trained in diocesan and archdiocesan seminaries. What little formation they get in the Franciscan intellectual tradition is primarily on the shoulders of people in this room. I'll quote an anecdote from the meeting that Finian mentioned earlier. When the provincials were asked if they would support, and you can back me up on this, Finian, to see if I'm getting these legends a little bit too hagiographical. When the provincials were asked if they would support a project on the retrieval of the Franciscan intellectual tradition, their first question was, what is it? They admitted among themselves that for the most part, they had been trained in other traditions. They were Ronarians, Skilobexians, Baltazarians. They were not Franciscans in their intellectual formation. In the years since the renewal of religious life with the Second Vatican Council, the renewal that has occurred among friars has been renewal in study of the sources of the life of Francis and early documents. That trilogy that Finian mentioned, I think it's an important project. I think it was a worthwhile project. But Francis is not the end of the Franciscan tradition. Even with the addition of Clare, having those two founders alone with their writings and early biographies does not give us the complete picture of the Franciscan tradition as it thinks its way through what it means to be church, what it means to act in society, and what it means to react to a created world around us. For that reason, I think it is urgent. Joe Kenichi said that we are within a window of opportunity of about 10 years in which the last of a generation trained in these schools of thought could actually pass it on to a new generation before we lose touch with a living tradition that we've been custodians of for 800 years. Why it is important. Why should we take this time? Why should people spend good money? Why should trees die? So that we can talk about the importance of creation and everything. Why is it important to talk about the retrieval of the Franciscan theological tradition? And I would like to say, first of all, because it is a gift to the church. I think you're going to be able to hear me okay, even if I move around. Are you? If you're not, I'll go back to that microphone, but it's bothering me that I can't move it. A gift to the church. Some people have remarked, and I think quite rightly, that the church, particularly in the English-speaking world right now, is desperately in need of an alternative vision. And, if we might put it in these terms, is desperate to discover an alternative orthodoxy. That is, a foundation for belief and practice that is thoroughly built on the church's tradition, that is thoroughly orthodox in its expression, and which is alternative to the prevailing theology in the universal church today. Since the beginnings, the late 1800s and early 1900s, those of you who have done your formation years earlier will probably remember the great Thomist or scholastic revival of the early 20th century, in which neo-scholasticism was to be proposed as the church's refutation of the doctrines of the modern world, that evil of modernism. When Roman authorities sought to find a clear expression of a theology that was useful for polemic against the beliefs of the modern world, and specifically designed to combat modern ideas, such as human freedom and separation of church and state, the belief in holding goods in common and such other unevangelical notions. The choice, and it was a political choice, was to choose a form derived from the theology and the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, known as Neo-Thomism. This is not, and I have to repeat this again, this is not the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas. This is a polemical form of an interpretation of the teaching of Thomas that was crafted in order to be set over against the modern world. It was a fundamentally reactionary and regressive move on the part of Roman authorities who at that time were feeling, and justifiably so, imprisoned by the modern world. These were the years of great conflict between church and the modern liberal state. The reactionary posture of Roman authorities was then promulgated in official norms, the most important of which was the 1917 Code of Canon Law, which prescribed for all the teaching of Thomas Aquinas as the norm of orthodoxy in the universal church. That put the Franciscan tradition into crisis. For even those who had a legitimate claim to another, an alternative tradition, and really they were speaking about only one, it was the Franciscan tradition, had to teach that tradition in the light of the teachings of the angelic doctor. So we find these monsters of theological books. Hopefully none of you are old enough to remember them. The teaching of the Franciscan school according to the mind of St. Thomas Aquinas. This is like the political speeches of John Kerry as interpreted by George W. Bush. It's an oxymoron. Not only were steps taken to make sure that other traditions, the alternative traditions, were taught in the light of the Neo-Thomist tradition, but those traditions, including our Franciscan tradition in first place, were threatened with extinction. Joe Kenichi's article makes for fascinating reading when you see the machinations of certain professors in Roman universities who wanted to make the litmus test of orthodoxy the affirmation of all of those statements of Thomas Aquinas, which are contrary to the teaching of the Franciscan school. It was clearly an attempt to marginalize and diminish the perceived orthodoxy of an alternative tradition. In those days, with the threat of modernism and the oath against modernism required of all seminary professors and all those being ordained, it was dangerous to speak about the alternative orthodoxy of the Franciscan view. Very dangerous indeed. We can be grateful to people like Parthenius Minges and others who had the courage, partly because they were old and venerable, they had the courage to step up and make the case for the Franciscan alternative orthodoxy even in those years. Carlo Balic, the members of the International Scotus Commission, by their relationships, their close relationships with popes and officials in Roman congregations, managed to protect some small sphere of freedom for the Franciscan tradition, at least that the propositions of the Franciscan school would not be condemned as heterodox. Why is it important to retrieve this Franciscan intellectual tradition? Because it's the unknown orthodoxy. What passes for orthodoxy today is only one side. To use the metaphor that John Paul II has frequently used in speaking of the broad view of the church in East and West, he says the church breathes with two lungs, the churches of the West and the churches of the East. We might say that within the Franciscan theological vision, we are the missing lung in the view of orthodoxy in the church today. If we, as Franciscans, are not committed to the retrieval of our own tradition, there probably is no one else who will do it.
You look around, excuse me. We hit people with microphones. Disculpe, hermano. We look around this room and say, but Lord, we are so few. We have among us only a few pieces of fish and some dried bread. How can we feed so many? Well, the answer of the Lord is, come to Colorado Springs, work on it for a couple of days, and you'll figure it out as the friars always do. I don't think that we can wait for the experts. I think we are the experts today. We need to become the experts, and we need to form a new generation of experts. Maybe not in medieval manuscript reading, perhaps not in making critical editions of Latin works. We actually have a fair number of people outside the Franciscan family who are happy to do that and do it for a living. But for us to become the experts on how to translate this vision, once we know it, into a heteropraxis, an orthopraxis that matches this orthodoxy. That application of a vision in pastoral work, in creativity, in forms of community, in artistic expression, have always been the strong points of the friars, the practical side of the Franciscan tradition. I don't think we all need to become theoreticians. A few theoreticians are probably enough. What we need to do is form people who are able to think with this mentality so that spontaneously, when confronted with an issue, a problem, a crisis in the church, we know how to speak from our alternative voice grounded in a tradition. This would be a gift to the church. For those who are discouraged with the rather narrow vision, I think we could call this, the one lung that is being used in the presentation of the church's tradition in these days, for people who have not found that very life-giving, the Franciscan tradition can offer a word of hope. Time and again, when people are exposed to, let's take a simple example, the view of the incarnation from the point of view of John Duns Scotus, as an event caused by love rather than occasioned by sin, there is a kind of spontaneous reaction of its rightness. And sometimes a kind of angry reaction. Why didn't somebody tell me that before I left the church? Why didn't someone propose to me this vision of an interpersonal God who is seen in community instead of this monistic, individualized God that I rejected 20 years ago? Why didn't someone explain to me the doctrine of the Trinity as the foundation of the life of the church and of the social order? Why didn't someone talk to me about the beauty of the material instead of arguing with me about science versus religion? We have a moral responsibility to present a vision to people who otherwise, I think, will not enter the church in the first place, or who will leave it if they are already in it. It's that margin those edges of the church where I think the friars have always felt at home in ways that other religious communities have not. We're not afraid of being on the fringes in what our former Minister General Giacomo Bini calls the zone di fratture, the areas of breakdown. Those areas where society and the church have fuzzy boundaries, where people who are not quite in the church or no longer in the church, but are not quite out of it, are looking for a path. They're looking for a way. They're looking for a word of hope. And I believe our Franciscan tradition, it's not the only one, but it is certainly one that can give hope to those people. But it's not only for the church. The gift that our tradition can provide is also a gift to the wider society in which we live, in service to the modern world. The gift that our tradition can provide is also a gift to the wider society in which we live, in service to the modern world. I've listed a few values of the Franciscan tradition, somewhat arbitrarily. I think we could probably list others as well. Values like humility, humanity, individuality within communion, freedom. For many people today, standard religious rhetoric does not speak to them of those values. If we could put it in rather harsh terms, much religious rhetoric sounds not like humility, but like pride. Coming from a position of power, frequently speaking down to the modern world. Humanity. So often religious discourse in our contemporary world, and I don't limit my criticism to Roman Catholics, is not a language of humanity. It is rather a language of a non-human, a superhuman, or a parahuman experience with which people find it very difficult to relate their own experience. If we can put it in these ways, it is a theology without flesh. Individuality within communion. Within our society, particularly within the United States, I can't speak for other English-speaking countries, the predominant religious symbol of God, divinity, and theology is the number one. Whether in advertising, logos, or language, it is the number one. God is the ultimate monad. Scratch beneath the surface, all of us have become Unitarians. Very little talk is given to the Trinity, the Trinitarian dimensions of either divinity or life. Strangely enough, in a society in which the individual and individualism are predominant, what is the predominant image of God? The single, isolated, and all-powerful individual, frequently conceived as male. What portions of our society find it impossible to listen to Christian religious language simply because of that kind of Unitarian monism, which to them does not speak to their experience of a human life lived in relationship. If our tradition is famous, perhaps among all the traditions of Christian theology, for its emphasis on the individual, on the unique, on the unrepeatable, how is it that our tradition is also the one that speaks most about the individual only really existing in a network of relationships? That diversity is not division. Diversity is the basis of communion and community. What a different image of religious language and of religious practice that would offer to the modern world, which does not think of religious, particularly Christian religious discourse, in those terms at all. Individuality within communion, freedom. Perhaps since the time of Pius IX, no term has been least liked by a certain strain of Catholic orthodoxy than the word freedom. Within modern society, religion is increasingly identified with intolerance. Not only with intolerance, but with violence. What does it mean to emphasize freedom, not only as a characteristic of the human individual and of human societies, but freedom as a very basic characteristic of God and who God is? What does it mean to cherish freedom without understanding freedom as rugged individualism? How can we understand and practice freedom as part of relationships? What does it mean to live in freedom without isolation? We could certainly go down a list of other virtues or values that the Franciscan intellectual tradition offers. All that I want to suggest is we have points within our tradition that mesh or at least touch points with people who are disaffected or simply bored with much of what they hear in official religious discourse today. And we also have points of contact with a wider society that finds it difficult to find a point of engagement with the church or with religious language generally. It's another reason for our being here these days. The retrieval of our Franciscan intellectual tradition is not only a word of hope for the church, but it also offers hope to our society. It offers a new way of seeing the church that many people have been deprived of. Whose responsibility is it? If not ours, whose? And if not now, when?